Hi, it's Dr. Crone. Welcome to our second video in the authoritarianism unit. Last time we examined the concept of authoritarianism, what it is, and how it develops in different countries. In this video, we'll learn about the different types of authoritarian regimes. Before we get started listing the types, here's some guidelines to remember. Comparative politics relies heavily on typology like these, and it uses typology to help us understand the differences between countries. But remember that when we use a typology, these types are generalized, and typing an individual country is a very subjective process. Each regime is unique, but we do look for patterns and comparisons. So maybe you know a lot about one type of country here that we're going to talk about, and you say, hey, wait a minute, I don't think it fits that pattern. That's absolutely legitimate to say because none of this is a black and white, cut and dried process. Okay, with that said, let's look at the four general types of authoritarian regimes. The first is totalitarian. The second type is called a personalistic dictatorship. The third are bureaucratic authoritarian regimes. And then finally, there's the hybrid or semi-authoritarian regime. We'll examine each one of these in depth and look at examples of them. Totalitarian regimes are considered the worst kind of authoritarian governments. These are regimes that commit genocide, other types of mass murder, political torture, mass political imprisonments, and various other atrocities in the name of the regime. The term totalitarian draws its meaning from the word total. A totalitarian government attempts total control over the totality of citizens' lives. The totalitarian regime has not only political control over the country, but also social and economic control. For example, a regime might require a certain style of appearance or clothing. It might require special ways of greeting others, such as key phrases or salutes. The Nazi Heil Hitler salute was required. People could be jailed for not using it. The regime will often have the power to assign citizens to certain jobs or places to live. All of these requirements are based on the imposition of a total ideology or way of thinking onto all of its citizens. The regime requires complete conformity to these ideological beliefs. Citizens are indoctrinated into the ideology and required to prove their loyalty to it. This is expected from cradle to grave. The picture here shows a Hitler Youth Organization group meeting in Nazi Germany. Children were required to become members of the Hitler Youth, and these groups served as ideological indoctrination groups. They required children to wear uniforms and taught them paramilitary skills. That's an example of that total cradle-to-grave control over citizens' lives. Nazi Germany is a classic example of a totalitarian government. So were the communist governments in a number of countries, such as the USSR under Stalin, China under Mao, or Cambodia under Pol Pot. Stalin's government, for example, killed more people than the Nazis did, than Hitler's did in Nazi Germany, probably because it was in power for much longer. In China under Mao, millions were killed and millions more were forcibly relocated to re-education camps as punishment for speaking out or even just for appearing not to follow communist principles. In Cambodia, a less well-known example, Pol Pot, the dictator in the 1970s, directed the starvation and murder of almost 1/4 of the population of Cambodia. Totalitarian regimes, while notorious, are actually fairly rare. The 20th century, unfortunately, was a horrible time period of such regimes. Most political scientists agree that today, North Korea and Eritrea are the only governments that really fall into that category. The second type of authoritarian government is a personalistic dictatorship, and these are much more common than totalitarianism. They're actually common all over the world and have been throughout time. A personalistic dictatorship has one ruler. Sometimes this is called an autocracy. And that ruler is supported by a small group of loyalists. And generally speaking, the big difference between a personalistic dictatorship and a totalitarian dictatorship like Nazi Germany is that the personalistic dictatorship has political control only, not usually control over economic choices of individuals or over their social lives and social choices. So it is political control. It affects the political part of the country. Generally speaking, as long as citizens follow orders and steer clear of the police or the military, they can kind of believe what they want to believe, and they're not necessarily controlled from cradle to grave. So often another difference between a personalistic dictatorship and a totalitarian regime is that there really isn't any sort of ideology. Totalitarian regimes are ruled by one of two ideologies, either communism or fascism. And a personalistic dictatorship doesn't usually have that. Instead, the dictator basically just wants to hold on to power for power's sake. Usually that dictator in power will justify their rule by some kind of economic or security necessity. So they might say something like, I know you want to have elections, we'll have elections once we get our economy back on track, or once we've dealt with that, our defense against the external threat from quote unquote fill in the blank. Could be a military problem, could be a refugee problem from other countries or immigrants or something like that. Could be an internal group that is being controlled and oppressed by the dictator. And these are, generally speaking, there's some kind of idea that eventually democracy will happen, but it can't happen right now. And meanwhile, the dictator will often rule for their entire life. So an example, kind of a classic example of a personalistic dictatorship happened in the country of Zimbabwe under their former ruler, President Robert Mugabe, who was kind of a classic example. If you want to know more about that, you can research about the history of Zimbabwe and see what kind of a ruler Mugabe was. He was not a pleasant person. Certainly, just because they're not totalitarians doesn't mean they don't have enemies killed and things like that. It's just not a total control of an entire kind of way of thinking. So there's plenty of other examples of personalistic dictatorships. I've got a few well-known examples of ones that are fairly current. All of these countries are still considered to be authoritarian, at least at some level, even if these rulers are not quite ruling them anymore. Venezuela has became a dictatorship. It had a democratic breakdown and actually a reasonably stable authoritarian regime for a short period of time under Nicolas Maduro, who was elected and then hung on to power and even manipulated his power to try to cancel his last, I believe it was his fourth or fifth re-election. He has since been ousted from that, and at the time I'm recording this in 2020, the power in Venezuela is kind of up for grabs, and Venezuela is in a political crisis. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the few actually absolute monarchies left in the world. So that would be a type of dictatorship, authoritarian dictatorship, when one person is ruling. King Abdullah right now is actually sharing power with his son, Mohammed bin Salman, who is the prince and sort of heir to the throne. And he's taken some power, but that's an example of at least as of this recording in 2020, that's what's going on right now in Saudi Arabia. One example of a very interesting dictatorship is Singapore, which is kind of a country that is only one city in Southeast Asia, and their dictator was known for being quote unquote a benevolent dictator, and Singapore was called a benevolent dictatorship. There was Singapore still has a market economy. fairly open economy, and lots of social control under the dictator. So it's up to you to decide whether you think how benevolent it was. That was kind of how they advertised Singapore, was it's a dictatorship, and it's clean and a wonderful place to live, and everybody follows the rules, and there were all kind of laws you could break in Singapore. And to be truthful, I don't know a whole lot about today's Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew actually passed away about 10 years ago as of this recording, and he was replaced by his son. And it still has characteristics of a dictatorship. And then finally, Egypt is a good example of democratic breakdown, actually or we might call it authoritarian persistence. Egypt had a moment during the Arab Spring of democratization for a short period of time, which I believe lasted about 3 or 4 years or so, until General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was able to take over Egypt, and now he is, as of 2020, currently ruling as a personalistic dictator. In addition to totalitarian regimes and personalistic dictatorships, another form of authoritarian rule is called a bureaucratic authoritarian regime. And these are also fairly common. In a state that's a bureaucratic authoritarian state, it's the institutions of government that are stable and powerful, and really all powerful in many ways. In many countries, it will be the military that has this power. So rather than having power seated in just one individual who's kind of supported by a group of lesser, sort of lackeys, for want of a better word, you have an institution that may support whoever is in power. So power could actually be found in one or more institutions. Often this is going to be the military, though, or the military will be included. In the 1970s, military-backed bureaucratic authoritarian regimes were especially common in Latin America. Many countries that are democracies now in Latin America previously were what they called militaristic dictatorships, meaning that the military ruled, and what they did was they would choose whoever they wanted to be the president. They would elevate that person to the presidency. It might or might not have been a general from the military, and in any case, it was someone the military approved of and felt that they could manipulate. And if the leader got on the wrong side of the military, they would just oust them and put a different leader in power. In other countries, religious leaders or religious organizations have acted with that kind of power. Classic example studied by Juan José Linz, who was Spanish, studied Spain under the dictator Franco. And Franco's rule was made possible by the support of a number of social institutions, but especially of the Catholic Church. So in many ways, the Catholic Church acted as the stable institution that kept Franco in power. The biggest example of a bureaucratic authoritarian regime in the world today is Communist China, since Mao. Mao was the last totalitarian ruler of China. And since Mao's death, China's Communist Party has become the center of its power. That party is very strong and it's extremely stable. It has survived numerous leaders, and it acts in many ways like the military did in some of those military dictatorships I talked about. The party elevates a leader of its choice. Some of those leaders are kind of prominent and well known, and their face is very prominent in global news. Xi Jinping, who is the current leader of China, is the chairman of the Communist Party, and is an example of someone who is very well known and has taken a lot of strong leadership. But there have also been, before Xi, there have been some lesser and not as powerful leaders. Through it all, though, it's the party that has been the stable source of power in China. So what I would predict is that if Xi gets on the wrong side of the majority of communist officials, that party will have the power to oust him and replace him. And so the party is the source of the country's stability. Bureaucratic authoritarian regimes are actually more stable and less likely to break down or go through democratization than, say, a personalistic dictatorship. China's been a strong example of that. The Chinese Communist Party was able to stay in power, an amazing feat, despite the fall of communism in almost all other places in the world. And many people think that the fact that Mao died in the 1970s and the Chinese Communist Party had 20 years or so, 15 years or so to kind of entrench and institutionalize its role, really aided China in being able to survive the very tumultuous time of the 1990s transition towards democratization in many communist countries. The last type of authoritarian regime is what we call the hybrid regime, or sometimes it's referred to as a semi-authoritarian regime. So this is a regime that combines features of democracy and authoritarianism, and that may sound strange, but this category has actually been increasing over the years. I think partly because democracy has become such a prominent and given so much value by the world and by world organizations, especially the United Nations, that countries with authoritarian regimes have found ways to include features of democracy while still maintaining power and not being a total democracy where power is vested only in the people. So we've seen a lot more of these in the past 20 years than was happening before. Lots of countries fall into this category, and it is a broad category. So some of the things we might see in a hybrid regime are that they may have competitive elections, although the government may be able to exclude some parties or may have final vetting over candidates. But in many ways, these elections do present the people with a choice, and they're not just sham elections. There may be opposition parties that are allowed to be seated and show opposition in whatever the legislature is. They may not be given enough power to actually affect outcomes, but the fact that they're seated and have a voice is often attributed to the regime allowing some form of some outlet for the people's opposition to be heard. Often they have formally independent judges, meaning that those judges are not just lackeys of the dictator or anything like that, but that they may actually be able to make independent judgments. And many of these regimes have allowed free media to some level, or freer choices to some level. Often this will go back and forth. In a regime like this, we'll often see an opening up of, let's say, access to the internet. And then if the people get too restive or something, that will be clamped back down again. So this is a really interesting kind of state to study, and Iran is a great example of a hybrid semi-authoritarian regime. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to respond to in your learning about Iran. You do have a reading about Iran, a case study called Democratic Features of Authoritarian Systems this time. So just a little background on Iran. It's basically a theocracy, which is a very interesting form of state. A theocracy is a state ruled by religious authorities, and they're very rare. Actually, Iran is the only functioning theocracy, true theocracy in the country, in the world today. So the most powerful religious authority, the religious authorities in Iran are in charge of appointing someone who has the position called supreme leader. And that supreme leader is in many ways an authoritarian ruler. So there have only been 2 supreme leaders in Iran under their current regime, which started in 1979. And the current one is named Ayatollah, which just means supreme leader, Khamenei. And Khamenei has a lot of power in the country, but he's not the only seat of power in the country. Iran has an elected parliament, and they do allow opposition in their parliament. And they also have a fairly freely elected president who does have some power and who has some independent power. So I want you to read more about this and how these kind of different power centers are woven together in Iran. Is a fascinating case. So read more about that in the case study that's assigned. And then for your discussion board, go ahead and list some things that you see in the reading. Like what characteristics do you see as democratic and what characteristics do you see as authoritarian in Iran? Don't just copy someone else's observations. Please add your twist to them. Add like your own flavor of these and your own analysis of these in your discussion board posts. And then consider commenting on what do you think of this kind of system? Is it good or bad? In the West, we're used to thinking of authoritarianism as bad and democracy as good. So what do you think of a hybrid system? Does it strike you as bad? Does it strike you as negative? Or does it strike you as a good solution for their country? What do you think about Iran? That's it for this video. So remember to complete your discussion board posts for this week by the deadlines, and good luck with your work. Have a great week.